I'm Joel Skousen, editor of World Affairs Brief. I'm a political scientist by training, was the former chairman of the Conservative National Committee during the Reagan administration, and have been active ever since in trying to alert people to what's going on in the world. This is very important to understand that there is real systematic good and evil in the world. The dialectic is where you create crises in order to induce good people to do things or accept things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. The reason for this, that you need to deceive people, and we're in all of this, we're talking about the Tea Party deception, we're talking about the deception of political parties. We need to understand that deception is something that has always been with us in the world and always will because of this systematic battle between good and evil. But there is a systematic good as well, and that is the role of conscience in people. And it's because certain people can sense that something's wrong, that evil has to use deception and dialectic in order to get people to do things in spite of conscience, in spite of sensing that something's wrong. In essence, when you create a big enough crisis, there's a feeling of panic. We have no choice. We have no power to resist. There's this feeling of futility. So even though people can sense what's right in conscience, they don't act according to it, or they follow along the path of least resistance because of the severity of the crisis. That's the reason why evil uses crises to change the world. In the same sense, the conspiracy has had the necessity of morphing into different organizations to be able to cover itself from discovery. We can go back, I think the conspiracy has been with us since the beginning of time. But when we begin, whether it's from Cain and Abel, or we talk about the Illuminati, starting in 1776, how ironic, you know, that there's this interplay between the movement of freedom in 1776 and the rise of a counter-movement. It's almost as if Satan and God, or Satan follows and sees what God is trying to do to promote liberty and has a counter-strategy in everything that comes about. There are key dates in history, like 1776, when you had a massive liberty for movement, whereby for the first time in history you'd had some very principled, libertarian-oriented people come into power. And at the same time you have this rise of the Illuminati. It got exposed. I believe it went underground and then began to use another organization, the Masonic lodges, to take its place. When that became exposed, they dropped out the lower levels of the Masonic so that they became rather as good old boy clubs, and they're still in use today. You can go into certain parts of Texas and you talk to people, and there are most people within a certain county are members of the lodge. And they know that if they get a traffic ticket, they can flash the ringer and they can get some type of immunity. Now, it isn't really illegal. It isn't anything to do with these broad-range conspiracies. But it is a good old boys network, and it allows people to rise within those networks and to be able to, and the higher-ups within those, to see, all right, who's corruptible, who's predictable, who can we bring along to a higher order or understanding. So it's my opinion that the Masonic level only participates in broad-range conspiracy issues above the 32nd or 33rd level. In the United States, in Europe, it's a different story. In Europe, the Masonic lodges have been much more deeply involved in conspiratorial, globalist, and New World Order issues. And we find the Masonic lodges are still very powerful in Italy especially, in Spain, Germany, and France. So what I'm saying or viewing is that conspiratorial forces morph into different forms. They use different crises, and above all, they are able to imitate and co-opt goodness in a variety of ways. It's important that to understand this is not a monolithic conspiracy of power. There are competing blocks. There's always competitors. Just like in the drug trade, the United States runs its own dark side drug trade to finance black operations. And higher-ups within the DEA and CIA are aware of these things. But there are always competitors coming up in the drug trade trying to piggyback onto this very, very lucrative profession. And so it is this conspiracy. A conspiracy of power has to give certain rewards to people. And that's why wealth is always a part of it, the inducement of wealth. It is not true, however, and I want to clarify one thing. Oftentimes in conspiratorial literature, such as in Allen's book or even in some of my uncle's book, you talk about the wealthy international bankers. Well, it is not true that every single international banker is involved in the conspiracy. It is not true that every wealthy banker is part of it. It is true that everyone who's part of it is wealthy. But it is not true that all big business is part of it or that all big banks are part of it. Almost all are now because they don't like competition and they tend to try to co-opt. But there is this continual competition of power. In the world scene, I believe that there are three predator centers of power. I believe the most powerful and the longest running structure of conspiracy to undermine liberty is what we call the Anglo-American power center. Centered primarily in London, but now has got most of its power transferred over to New York and the United States just because that's where most of the wealth is. The other power is Russia, and the other power is China. I believe that they are competing. They're temporary allies because they know that eventually they're going to be in a war with the Anglo-American establishment. But eventually they will have to fight it out among themselves. The first step is to recognize when someone is parroting or repeating the establishment line. In other words, good people have to, and I'm trying to take this out of the issue of understanding the right or wrong of what they're saying. This is how deception occurs with good people. They see he's saying the truth, therefore he must be good. It works, therefore it must be right. Now, neither of those propositions are true. Things can work using false philosophies, using false mechanisms, using deception. People can say the right things for the wrong motive in order to promote themselves in ways of which will further deceive them. That's what disinformation is all about, is giving a certain portion of truth so that you can drop in major areas that are false. So it is not enough to judge what is being done in life by whether or not it's true or false. One must learn to recognize what is an establishment line of attack, an establishment direction, and learn who is parroting that, because real truth never goes very far along an establishment line without diverging from it significantly in truth. That is why the establishment always says our position is extremist, because we diverge from their establishment line on significant points, which they always label extreme. That's the way they get people to disregard truth that diverges from the establishment line. This happens whether it's establishment medical protocols. The best truths are outside those protocols. That isn't to say that everything within the establishment is false. Far from it. Most of it is right, most of it is good. But it's leading through the exclusion of critical truths. It's leading people in a direction will keep them blind and keep them from seeing the crucial truths. So, once you see someone parroting the establishment line, you have to ask, is he part of the establishment or is he not part of it? I'm going to take you through a truth diagram here of yes or no and then where to go from that. If a person is not part of the establishment, but he's parroting the establishment line, he's usually being used because of several reasons. One, either they're too ambitious. I put Mitt Romney in that category. Mitt Romney is not a corrupt individual, but he's someone bending over backwards so badly to please the establishment because he wants to be accepted by them. He wants to rise. He wants to be president. They can be predictably liberal or moderate. There are certain people who have an innate sense about right or wrong. There are certain people who have an innate sense about what's establishment and what's popular. And they seem like a compass to seek only for those things which will make them more populous. We see that with kids in school. There are people who are outsiders. They're always pushing the edge, whether for good or evil. And there's people who are right there in the middle of the road. They're afraid to do anything that will be criticized. They start to push beyond those subtle hints about don't go there or you don't have a need to know. And they actually have to be warned off with threats. And those threats can take place directly, threats to themselves. They first of all will start to threaten their job. If that doesn't get in the way and they actually become a whistleblower, they often start to threaten their family. And sometimes they threaten by pointing out another person who has somehow died by mysterious circumstances where it was ruled a suicide. And they then explain to them that it wasn't a suicide. That's a person who wouldn't be quiet, just like you. And there are various levels of threats of which they can escalate. But at the higher level, for people who are fully corrupted, the Bill Clintons of the world, for example, they use the promise of immunity. It's a very powerful thing. The promise that we can make sure that the things that we have on tape of you doing don't ever see the light of day. It's a combination of blackmail and immunity, and they see that all the time happening in government. They see somebody caught who's on the dark side of government, and they see a telephone going to the judge, and the judge lets him off, or the prosecutor, district attorney pleads it down. They see how immunity can be a real benefit to them in life. So that's some of the tactics of how they keep people at various different levels of corruption in the system, both incentives and for threats. On the good side, for instance, they know how to play the naive people. They know how to play the people who want recognition. So to recap, we have 4 different levels, I believe, or categories of how the conspiracy is managed in terms of its personnel and how it grows and ascends in power. The lowest level, the 4th level, are people who know and see enough to see that there's a control system but have been told or think that it's benevolent.